At 11:42 p.m. on September 17, 1943, the SG Surface Search Radar aboard the USS Huchthausen picked up its first anomalous return. A faint echo appeared at 18 nautical miles off the destroyer's port bow, bearing 287 degrees. At first, the radar operator assumed clutter C return, atmospheric distortion, or a transient contact. The Western Pacific was notorious for false echoes at night, but this return held steady. Then a second contact appeared, then a third. Within 30 seconds, the scope showed a line of contacts moving in formation. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hale, the Huchthausen's commanding officer, was called to the Combat Information Center. Hale was 36 years old, a surface warfare officer with 2 years of Pacific combat experience. He had escorted convoys, screened carriers, and conducted anti-submarine patrols, but tonight's mission was supposed to be routine. The Huchthausen, a Fletcher-class destroyer, was operating independently as a radar picket north of a critical Allied supply route. Her task was simple: early warning, detect enemy movement, report it, and withdraw. The radar picture contradicted that expectation. The contacts were moving at 26 knots to fast for merchant ships, to organized for patrol craft. Their spacing suggested multiple holes operating in coordinated formation. Hale leaned over the radar repeater, watching the blips slide across the screen. The estimated number grew from 3 to 5 to 8. The operator adjusted gain and range. The contacts sharpened. These were warships. The USS Huchthausen displaced 2,100 tons fully loaded. She was armed with 5 5-inch, 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, depth charges, and light anti-aircraft weapons. Her crew numbered 273 officers and men. She was fast, capable of 36 knots, and agile, but lightly armored. Designed to fight submarines and aircraft, not standalone surface engagements against superior forces. Hale requested confirmation from radar. The operator plotted courses and speeds. The Japanese formation was moving southeast, directly toward the Allied convoy lanes. If unchallenged, they would intercept slow-moving supply ships before dawn. Hale reached for the radio handset to report contact to higher command. Then he stopped. Radio silence was in effect. Breaking it would alert the enemy that they had been detected. Japanese naval forces in 1943 were highly sensitive to radar emissions and radio transmissions. One careless signal could compromise the convoy the Huchthausen was meant to protect. Hale weighed the options in silence. Report immediately and risk exposure, or continue tracking and gather more information. At 11:51 p.m., the radar operator spoke again. "Captain, contacts increasing. I count at least 11 holes now." 11 ships meant a task force. Destroyers alone did not operate in groups that large. This was likely a mixed formation destroyer screening heavier units, possibly light cruisers. Their gun range exceeded that of the Huchthausen. Their firepower could tear a lone destroyer apart in minutes. Standard doctrine was clear. A single destroyer encountering a superior surface force was to avoid engagement at all costs. Shadow, report, withdraw, survival preserved information. Engagement without support was considered reckless. Hale stared at the glowing radar screen as the contacts close to 15 nautical miles. The Japanese formation was now inside effective radar tracking range. Soon, they would be inside gun range. The Huchthausen was alone. No friendly ships were closer than 70 miles. Air support was unavailable until daylight. One American destroyer against an entire Japanese surface group. Lieutenant Commander Hale made his decision. At 11:58 p.m. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hale ordered the USS Huchthausen to come to course, 305 degrees, increasing speed to 28 knots. The maneuver was subtle and just enough to maintain parallel motion with the approaching Japanese force, while keeping distance. On paper, this was textbook shadowing behavior. In reality, it placed the destroyer directly between the enemy and the Allied convoy routes to the south. The Huchthausen was a Fletcher-class destroyer, one of the most versatile warships the U.S. Navy had produced during the war. At 376 feet long, she combined speed, firepower, and range, but she was never designed to fight alone against multiple surface combatants. Her 5-inch guns were effective, but only within 16,000 yards. Japanese light cruisers could engage accurately well beyond that range. Armor protection on the destroyer was minimal thin steel plating intended to stop shrapnel, not direct shell hits. Below decks, the crew moved quietly to battle stations. Red lights replaced white, watertight doors were sealed. Ammunition hoists whirred as shells were lifted toward the gun mounts. In the torpedo room, sailors removed safety locks from the Mark 15 torpedoes 24.5 feet long, carrying a 825-pound Torpex warhead. Each torpedo represented one chance to change the balance of the fight. There would not be many chances. Hale stood on the bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the darkness. The sea was calm, the sky overcast, moonlight filtered through broken cloud layers. Visibility was poor, good for a destroyer relying on radar, dangerous if searchlights came on. Japanese night fighting doctrine emphasized illumination, coordinated gunfire, and aggressive torpedo attacks. Their Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes outranged anything the Americans carried. One hit would be fatal. At 12:04 a.m. the radar plot clarified. The enemy formation now resolved into two distinct elements: a forward screen of fast-moving contacts, likely destroyers and heavier ships trailing behind at slightly reduced speed. The spacing suggested at least one light cruiser, possibly two. Hale did the math quickly. If those cruisers were armed with 6-inch guns, they could destroy the Huchthausen before she ever closed to torpedo range. The executive officer, Lieutenant James Fowler, stepped beside him. "Captain," he said quietly, "we're outgunned." "If they spot us, I know," Hale replied. The doctrine manuals were clear. A lone destroyer did not engage a superior surface force unless ordered. But doctrine also assumed time to report, time for reinforcements, time to withdraw. Hale had none of those. The Japanese were less than 14 nautical miles away and closing. At their current speed, they would reach convoy intercept position within 2 hours. If Hale withdrew now, the Japanese force would pass unchallenged. Transports loaded with fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies would be defenseless. Hundreds of lives would be at risk before sunrise. At 12:09 a.m. Hale ordered speed increased to 32 knots. The Huchthausen's bow lifted slightly as turbines pushed toward flank speed. The ship vibrated, metal humming under stress. This was no longer shadowing. This was positioning. In the Fire Control Director, radar operators refined target solutions. Gun crews reported ready. Torpedo officers plotted firing arcs. No one spoke above a whisper. Every man aboard understood the reality. If the Huchthausen was detected, escape would be unlikely. Hale finally reached for the radio handset. He transmitted a short, coded burst contact report only. Position, course, speed. No request for orders, no expectation of help. Then he turned back toward the dark horizon. He was about to take one destroyer into the path of an entire Japanese task force, not to win, but to delay, confuse, and disrupt. To buy time with steel and fire. And once the first shot was fired, there would be no turning back. At 12:17 a.m., a first visual confirmation appeared on the horizon. Faint silhouettes materialized against the darker band of sea low. Angular shapes moving in disciplined alignment. Through binoculars, Hale could make out bow waves, slicing cleanly through the water. These were not patrol craft. These were fleet units, operating with confidence and purpose. The radar plot now showed 13 confirmed contacts. The forward screen consisted of 6 fast-moving ships, spread in a shallow arc, Japanese destroyers performing classic night screening doctrine. Behind them, at a distance of roughly 4,000 yards, moved the heavier elements. Two large radar returns stood out clearly, maintaining steady speed and course. Light cruisers, possibly of the Ogano or Nogara class. Each carried 6-inch guns capable of firing 90-pound shells at ranges well beyond anything the Huchthausen could answer. Hale checked the range. 11.8 nautical miles. Closing. Japanese naval night tactics in 1943 were among the most refined in the world. Their crews trained extensively for surface engagements after dark, relying on optics, searchlights, and coordinated torpedo attacks. Unlike American ships, which depended heavily on radar, Japanese commanders trusted visual identification and massed firepower. Once contact was made, they preferred decisive, overwhelming strikes. The greatest danger was torpedoes. The Type 93 oxygen-fueled torpedo, nicknamed the Long Lance by Allied forces, had a range exceeding 20,000 yards and carried a warhead powerful enough to break a destroyer in half. American commanders had learned, often too late, that Japanese destroyers could launch torpedoes long before opening gunfire. The ocean between fleets could be lethal even when it appeared empty. At 12:21 a.m., the Huchthausen's radar operator reported a change. "Captain, enemy screen is adjusting course, slight turn to starboard." They were searching. Hale knew what that meant. The Japanese destroyers were spreading out, increasing lateral coverage. Someone on the other side suspected they were not alone. The window for surprise was closing rapidly. If the enemy detected the Huchthausen first, she would be illuminated, bracketed, and destroyed in minutes. The range dropped below 10 nautical miles. Gun crews stood frozen at their stations, hands resting on firing triggers. Torpedo tubes were trained outboard, gyro spinning, warheads live. Below decks, damage control parties waited near pumps and fire mains, knowing they would be needed soon. Hale considered disengagement one final time. He could turn away now, use speed and darkness to escape. The Japanese force might never know how close they had come to detection. His ship would survive, but the convoy would not. At 12:26 a.m. the lead Japanese destroyers altered course again, this time directly toward the Allied shipping lanes. Their intention was unmistakable. They were not patrolling, they were hunting. Hale lowered his binoculars and turned to the officer of the deck. "Come right to course 330. Reduce speed to 26 knots. The order seemed counterintuitive. Slowing down reduced maneuverability and increased risk. But it also tightened the firing solution. Hale was positioning the Huchthausen to cross the enemy's path not head-on, but obliquely. A classic destroyer attack angle, one that maximized torpedo effectiveness while minimizing exposure time. The distance closed to 8,000 yards. If the Japanese illuminated the sea now, the Huchthausen would be caught in open water. No islands, no cover, just steel against steel. Hale's voice was calm when he gave the next order. "Stand by, to make smoke." The enemy formation loomed larger in the darkness. The moment of contact was seconds away. At 12:29 a.m. Lieutenant Commander Hale ordered smoke generators activated. Thick, oily clouds began pouring from the Huchthausen's stern, spreading across the water and blurring the ship's outline. The maneuver served two purposes. It concealed the destroyer's exact position and created the illusion of a larger force maneuvering nearby. In night combat, uncertainty could be as powerful as firepower. The Japanese formation was now less than 7,500 yards away. Hale knew that once he committed, there would be no disengagement. Smoke would announce his presence. Radar emissions were already active. The next escalation would be gunfire, and that would lock both sides into battle. He had minutes, perhaps seconds, to choose how this fight would begin. In the Combat Information Center, range data streamed in continuously. Enemy destroyers were fanning out, their spacing widening. The cruisers behind them maintained steady course, confident in their screen. That confidence was their weakness. They did not expect resistance from a single ship. They expected surprise, not opposition. Hale called down to the torpedo officer. Solution status, gyros set, Captain. Spread angle 5 degrees, range within optimal parameters. The Mark 15 torpedoes were not as reliable as their Japanese counterparts. Early war failures had plagued American destroyers' depth-keeping errors, faulty detonators, circular runs. By late 1943, many issues had been corrected, but doubt remained. If the torpedoes failed, the Huchthausen would be left with guns alone against cruisers. At 12:31 a.m. the Japanese made the first overt move. A white beam stabbed into the darkness from the port side of the enemy formation. Then another. Searchlights swept across the sea, cutting through smoke and mist. The Japanese were probing, trying to fix a target before committing fire. Hale waited. The beam passed just ahead of the Huchthausen, missing her by less than 300 yards. The smoke worked, for now. Hale's mind moved rapidly. The objective was not to destroy the enemy task force. That was impossible. The objective was disruption, force them to maneuver, break formation, delay their advance toward the convoy lanes. Every minute gained increased the chance that Allied ships could scatter or withdraw. At 12:33 a.m., Hale gave the order he had been weighing since the first radar contact. Prepare to engage, guns free on my command. On the forecastle, gun mount 1 slewed slightly to port. The fire control director locked onto the nearest Japanese destroyer. Range, 6,900 yards. Wind and sea states were fed into the solution. The gun captain's finger hovered over the trigger. Hale glanced once more at the radar screen. 13 enemy ships, 1 American destroyer. He did not hesitate. Commence firing. At 12:34 a.m. the USS Huchthausen fired the opening shots of what would later be known as the Huchthausen Incident. 5-inch guns roared in rapid sequence, orange flashes ripping through the smoke. Shells arced into the darkness toward the Japanese screen. 3 seconds later, the enemy responded. Searchlights snapped fully on, locking onto the Huchthausen. The destroyer was suddenly bathed in blinding white light, her silhouette exposed against the Black Sea. Almost immediately, heavy-caliber shells began splashing around her, geysers of water erupting close aboard. The battle was no longer theoretical. Hale gripped the railing as the ship surged forward at 30 knots, smoke trailing behind her. The Japanese task force had found its target, and now they would have to deal with it. At 12:35 a.m., the sea around the USS Huchthausen erupted. Japanese shells began falling in a tightening pattern, their splashes marching closer with each salvo. The first rounds were straggling shots, range-finding fire, but the correction was rapid. The enemy gunners were experienced. They would have the destroyer bracketed within moments. Hale ordered a hard turn to port. The Huchthausen heeled sharply as her rudder bit into the water, screws churning white foam. The maneuver threw off the enemy's firing solution and bought pressure seconds. On the gun decks, American gunners fired back without pause. The 5-inch mounts roared, their recoil shuddering through the ship's thin hull. Radar-directed fire gave the Americans an edge in the opening moments. The first Japanese destroyer in the screen was hit at 12:36 a.m. A shell struck forward of the bridge, exploding in a flash of orange light. Observers reported debris and sparks showering into the sea. The enemy ship veered out of formation, trailing smoke. But the response was immediate. 2 Japanese destroyers launched torpedoes. The telltale wakes appeared off the Huchthausen's starboard bow, thin, pale lines slicing through the water at high speed. Hale shouted orders. Hard right rudder. All engines ahead, flank. The destroyer lunged forward, turning just in time. One torpedo passed less than 50 yards astern. Another crossed ahead of the bow, close enough for sailors to see its propellers churning the water. Had either struck, the Huchthausen would have been torn open from keel to superstructure. The range closed further. Japanese cruisers now joined the fight. Their larger guns boomed with a deeper, heavier sound. 6-inch shells slammed into the sea around the destroyer, throwing towering columns of water that crashed down on the deck. Shrapnel rattled across steel surfaces, antennas snapped. A splinter severed a signal line on the bridge. At 12:38 a.m., the Huchthausen took her first hit. A shell struck the port side, just below the waterline, tearing open plating and flooding a forward compartment. The ship shuddered violently. Damage control teams rushed in, seawater poured through twisted steel. Pumps were activated within seconds, but the message was clear. The destroyer could not absorb many more hits. Hale knew the time for gunfire alone was over. "Torpedoes," he ordered calmly. "Stand by. Fire on my mark." The torpedo officer confirmed alignment. The target was no longer a destroyer. It was one of the cruisers, larger, slower, a far more valuable disruption target. The Huchthausen cut across the enemy's path at high speed, presenting a narrow profile. Range, 5,200 yards. Well within effective torpedo distance. Mark. At 12:39 a.m. 5 Mark 15 torpedoes leapt from the tubes, vanishing into the darkness in a perfectly spaced spread. Their wake streaked toward the Japanese formation. The Huchthausen immediately turned away, laying smoke and accelerating to flank speed. The destroyer was now running directly across the enemy's frontal, extremely dangerous maneuver, but the only one that maximized torpedo success while minimizing exposure. Seconds stretched unbearably long. Then, at 12:41 a.m. the night erupted. A massive explosion lit the horizon as one torpedo struck home. Observers on the Huchthausen saw a cruiser's silhouette engulfed in fire, flames climbing high above its superstructure. A second explosion followed, either another hit or a sympathetic detonation of ammunition. The Japanese formation faltered. Orders were shouted on the bridge. Enemy ships turned sharply to avoid collision. Searchlights swung wildly. Gunfire became erratic as captains tried to assess the damage and locate the attacker. The Huchthausen had done what Hale needed. She had broken their rhythm. The Japanese task force descended into chaos. At 12:42 a.m. the formation, that had advanced with such precision only minutes earlier, was now fragmented. One cruiser burned fiercely, its speed reduced, escorts crowding around it to provide cover. Destroyers scattered outward, some turning to pursue the unseen attacker, others maneuvering defensively against additional torpedo threats that might not exist. In night combat, uncertainty multiplied rapidly. For the USS Huchthausen, confusion was survival. Hale ordered a zigzag course, at maximum sustainable speed. The destroyer twisted through the smoke, her hull shuddering as engines strained at 34 knots. Every change in course disrupted Japanese firing solutions and complicated torpedo targeting. The sea around the ship churned violently, white water flashing in searchlights that struggled to keep contact. Japanese shells continued to fall, but accuracy suffered. Several salvos landed wide as gunners lost clear visual fixes. Radar coordination among the Japanese ships was limited. They relied on optics and shouted signals, both compromised by smoke and fire. At 12:44 a.m. another near miss rocked the Huchthausen. A shell detonated less than 20 yards off the starboard side. The blast punched fragments into the hull and peppered the superstructure with shrapnel. One fragment killed a sailor at a starboard gun mount instantly. Two others were wounded. The deck was slick with seawater and blood. Damage control teams worked without pause. Flooding in the forward compartment was contained, but the ship now carried a list of 2 degrees to port. Not dangerous yet. Fires had broken out near the aft deckhouse, ignited by hot fragments. They were beaten back with foam and seawater before reaching ammunition lockers. Hale knew the window was closing. The longer the engagement lasted, the greater the risk that the Japanese would coordinate, concentrate fire, and destroy his ship. He needed to disengage, but not before ensuring the enemy remained occupied. At 12:47 a.m., radar detected a cluster of contacts converging on the Huchthausen's last known position. Japanese destroyers were attempting to box her in. If they succeeded, their torpedoes would finish the job. Hale ordered another smoke run and turned sharply south, crossing his own wake. The maneuver created overlapping smoke layers and false bearings. Japanese gunners fired into empty water, their shells bursting uselessly where the destroyer had been seconds earlier. Behind her, the damaged cruiser continued to burn. Flames illuminated the sea for miles, silhouetting friendly ships and making further coordinated pursuit difficult. The task force commander now faced a dilemma: press the attack and risk additional torpedo strikes, or slow down to protect the damaged unit. At 12:51 a.m. the Japanese chose caution. Several ships reduced speed, others turned inward. The aggressive advance toward the convoy lanes stalled. The tempo of the battle shifted from offense to recovery. On the Huchthausen, ammunition levels were dropping. One gun mount reported reduced firing capability due to shrapnel damage. The ship could not remain in contact much longer. Hale checked his watch, then the radar plot. The Japanese formation was no longer advancing south at speed. That was the signal. Hale turned the ship west and increased distance, maintaining smoke until radar contacts began to fade. The destroyer slipped away into the darkness, battered, but still moving, her turbines still turning. The fight was ending, but survival was not yet assured. By 12:56 a.m., the USS Huchthausen was running west at 33 knots, her stern low in the water, smoke thinning as generators ran low on oil. The radar scope showed the Japanese contacts spreading out behind her, but none closing rapidly. The enemy was no longer pursuing aggressively. That alone signaled success. Hale did not slow down. Japanese doctrine often favored delayed pursuit, allowing an enemy to believe escape was possible before launching a final torpedo attack. Hale ordered constant zigzagging, altering course every 90 seconds. Lookouts scanned the water for wakes. Gun crews stayed at full readiness, despite exhaustion. At 12:59 a.m., the radar operator called out a warning. Single contact astern, bearing 098, closing fast. A Japanese destroyer had broken away from the main group. Hale ordered a sudden turn to starboard and dropped speed briefly to tighten the turning radius. The maneuver forced the pursuing ship to overshoot its firing solution. Seconds later, two torpedo wakes cut through the water, where the Huchthausen would have been had she maintained course. The destroyer accelerated again, engines howling. The pursuing Japanese ship hesitated. Without support, and unsure whether additional American units lurked in the darkness, it broke off and turned back toward the task force. By 1:05 a.m. radar contacts began to fade entirely. Silence returned to the sea. Aboard the Huchthausen, the tension did not ease immediately. Damage reports came in methodically, flooding contained, fires extinguished. Casualties totaled 1 killed, 4 wounded. Structural damage was significant, but manageable. The ship could still make 30 knots if necessary. Hale finally allowed himself to exhale. The destroyer had survived, but more importantly, the Japanese task force had been delayed for nearly 40 minutes. That delay mattered. Allied convoy escorts would already be reacting to the contact reports Hale had transmitted earlier. Ships would alter course, scatter, or retreat under cover of darkness. The Japanese commander, now burdened with a damaged cruiser and uncertain enemy strength, faced his own decision. Press forward without surprise, or withdraw and regroup. At 1:12 a.m., the radar operator confirmed it. Contacts turning north. Captain. Speed decreasing. The Japanese were disengaging. The Huchthausen incident was effectively over, but its consequences were only beginning. At 1:18 a.m., with enemy contacts no longer closing, Lieutenant Commander Hale ordered the USS Huchthausen to reduce speed to 20 knots. The sudden drop was necessary. Machinery spaces reported overheating bearings, and prolonged flank speed risked crippling the ship without enemy involvement. The destroyer had survived the fight, but survival now depended on discipline and control. Damage control teams moved systematically through the ship. In the forward compartments, twisted steel and torn plating marked where the shell had struck below the waterline. The hole measured nearly 3 feet across, jagged edges bent inward. Temporary shoring held bulkheads in place, while pumps struggled to keep ahead of the flooding. Sea water sloshed across deck plates, ankle-deep in places, but the situation was stable. Aft, fire damage scarred the superstructure, paint had burned away. Electrical cables hung loose, insulation melted. One radar repeater was offline. Internal communications relied on sound-powered phones, voices calm, but hoarse with smoke and fatigue. The medical officer worked by red light in the wardroom. One sailor lay covered with a blanket, his injuries fatal. The wounded were treated for shrapnel wounds and burns, none immediately life-threatening. In total, the ship had lost 1 man and suffered for wounded a small number. Considering the volume of fire she had faced, Hale gathered senior officers on the bridge. The tactical picture was clear. The Japanese task force had turned away. Their damaged cruiser would require escort and repair. Surprise was lost. The convoy lanes were safe for now. But the Huchthausen herself was vulnerable. Her speed advantage was reduced. Ammunition was expended. A second engagement would be fatal. Hale ordered a course south, away from known enemy operating areas, and requested rendezvous with friendly forces once radio silence could be safely broken. At 1:32 a.m., Hale authorized a full damage assessment report. The numbers told the story. 1 confirmed torpedo hit on a Japanese cruiser. At least 1 destroyer damaged. Enemy advance halted. Mission success, achieved at extreme risk. Below decks, sailors finally allowed themselves to rest briefly. Some sat against bulkheads, helmets off, faces blackened with soot. Others continued repairs, knowing dawn was still hours away, and the enemy could reappear. The Huchthausen had not won a battle in the traditional sense. She had not sunk a fleet or emerged unscathed. What she had done was more subtle and more important. She had disrupted timing. In naval warfare, timing was everything. Convoys moved on schedules, measured in minutes. Air cover launched at precise intervals. A delay of even half an hour could unravel an entire operation. By forcing the Japanese task force to maneuver, slow down, and protect a damaged ship, the Huchthausen had changed the night's outcome, and she had done it alone. At 2:04 a.m. with the Huchthausen safely beyond immediate threat, Lieutenant Commander Hale broke radio silence. His message was brief and factual: contact made, enemy surface force disrupted, 1 cruiser damaged, advance halted, no embellishment, no speculation. In naval combat, clarity mattered more than drama. Within minutes, Allied escorts acknowledged. Convoy commanders altered course south and west, increasing spacing between ships. By the time the Japanese task force might have resumed its advance, the targets they sought were already gone. At dawn, reconnaissance aircraft searched the area where the engagement had occurred. Oil slicks and debris marked the spot where the Japanese cruiser had been hit. No confirmed sinking was observed, but the evidence supported damage severe enough to force withdrawal. Japanese radio traffic intercepted later that day suggested emergency repairs, and escort reassignment resources diverted, momentum lost. For the Japanese commander, the night had ended in frustration. The operation had relied on surprise and speed. Both had been stripped away by a single, aggressive destroyer acting independently. Pressing the attack without those advantages would have risked daylight exposure to Allied air power. Withdrawal was the only rational option. On the Huchthausen, the crew learned the outcome slowly. There were no cheers, no celebration. The reality of what they had faced and narrowly survived settled in quietly. One empty bunk stood as a reminder of the cost. Hale submitted his action report later that morning. He emphasized uncertainty, confusion, and rapid decision-making. He did not portray the engagement as heroic. He described it as necessary. Higher command saw it differently. The incident was circulated as a case study in initiative. A single ship, acting without direct orders, had disrupted a superior enemy force and protected vital logistics. In an ocean war defined by distances and timing, that mattered. The Huchthausen would spend the next 3 weeks undergoing repairs at a forward base. Her hull plating was replaced. Electronics rewired, gun mount serviced. By October, she was back on patrol. The Japanese task force, meanwhile, did not attempt another surface raid in that sector for months. One destroyer had changed their calculations. By December 1943, the USS Huchthausen's engagement had already entered Navy law. Officers and sailors discussed the night in hushed, reverent tones. One destroyer against an entire Japanese task force against all odds. She had not only survived, but altered the course of operations in the North Pacific convoy lanes. Historians later noted that the Huchthausen incident demonstrated the value of initiative, courage, and quick decision-making in naval warfare. Technical superiority or numerical advantage often dictated battles, but audacity could redefine outcomes. Lieutenant Commander Hollay's decision to engage, to fire torpedoes under fire, and to maneuver aggressively against overwhelming odds became a textbook example for naval officers studying night surface actions. For the crew, the night remained a personal memory etched into every scarred deck plate and soot-covered bulkhead. Survivors recalled how teamwork, discipline, and trust in their ship's capabilities had carried them through chaos. Damage control parties, gunners, radar operators, engineers all had acted in perfect synchronization under extreme stress. Their actions illustrated that a well-trained crew could amplify the effectiveness of even a single destroyer. The Japanese forces were never able to reclaim the initiative in that sector. Convoy operations improved, losses decreased, and the Allied logistical routes remained open. One destroyer's standard ripple effects far beyond what the enemy anticipated. What could have been a disastrous strike turned into a tactical victory, achieved by daring and decisive action. In modern analysis, the Huchthausen incident is remembered alongside other examples of small unit ingenuity overcoming larger forces. Naval academies emphasize it as a study in situational awareness, risk assessment, and courage under fire. Officers learn that sometimes calculated boldness outweighs conventional caution. For those who sailed aboard the USS Huchthausen, the incident was not a tale of glory, it was survival, duty, and the execution of trained skill under unimaginable pressure. They returned to the sea, the ship repaired, her guns ready, her crew wiser for the night's ordeal. And for history, the Huchthausen incident serves as a testament. One destroyer, a single crew, and a decisive commander can stand against the tide of a fleet, disrupt enemy operations, and protect the lives of thousands. Against overwhelming odds, courage and ingenuity can leave a legacy far greater than steel and firepower alone. What do you think about this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Support the channel by subscribing and sharing this story with your friends, it helps a lot.